All right, everyone, I'm going to be running a new campaign with my new homebrew world. Here's 50 pages of lore and history of why the humans and elves hate each other, and of the time over 5,000 years ago that Orcus tried to take over the world. I expect you to read all of it before session 0. What relevance does this have to the campaign? None. I just wrote it all as exposition, and if you don't want to read it, then, well, sorry, you just can't play in this campaign. Hail and well met, adventurers. Perhaps what you just heard is something that's all too familiar to you, though I sincerely hope it isn't. But it's a trap that a lot of people fall into when they start looking at world building. That's what today's video is about. I will be taking a look at the process of world building, mostly focusing on worlds for Dungeons and Dragons. This could be easily applied to really any other setting where you would need to world build. I'll be looking at a couple different approaches to world building, and I'll talk about some essential things that you need to be thinking about when you do it. And finally, I will end the video by taking a look at one of the worlds that I have built myself. When it comes to world building, there are two primary approaches. There's bottom-up and there's top-down. A bottom-up approach is when you start with something very small and you grow from there. So an example of this would be you build the city or the town or the village that the campaign is starting in, and you figure out who lives there, what it's like, all that sort of things. And then you grow the world as the party needs it to. So as long as the party is staying in that city, you're not going to build the world outside of the city. Once they leave, you build it then. Typically, this means that the whole world isn't going to be done at the beginning of the campaign. In many cases, the world isn't even totally made by the end of the campaign. This can be helpful for some DMs who can get kind of wrapped up in the whole big grand scale of the world sort of thing. And it can be helpful to focus on just something small and focus on making that detailed and then filling the world out from there. A top-down approach is basically the opposite. A top-down approach is where you start big and then you go smaller. Personally, this is the approach that I tend to use. It will often start with a world map or a map of the main continent of the world. Usually this means that the world as a whole is done earlier, but the details of smaller places like a village or a city are worked out as you go or as you need them through the campaign. There's a few essential things that you need to think about in most cases when you are building a world. The first thing that you need to be thinking about is how the cultures are arranged in kingdoms, empires, whatever it may be. If there's any key cities, then you should be thinking about that. You should be thinking about what those key cities are known for. It doesn't really make sense to just put a city on a map and say, yeah, this city's important. I don't really know why, but it's just important. Another thing you need to think about that ties in with this is you need to be thinking about a place for each of the races. So elves, dwarves, humans, whatever races you have in your world. You need to think about where they come from, how they interact, where they live. And there's a couple different approaches for this as well. The two big ones are racial kingdoms or mixed kingdoms. So a racial kingdom is where you have an entire region of the world where, like, there's only elves living over here and there's only dwarves living up here. And sure, there might be some other races mixed in as traders and merchants and the like. But for the most part, it's dominated by one particular race. Or you can go with a mixed race kingdom or empire, where you have an area where there's a lot of mixing of humans and elves or dwarves and gnomes, some sort of compound thing where there's a culture that entwines both of them, but there are separate races involved. Another thing you need to think about is plane-touched races. So plane-touched races would be things like Aasimar, Tieflings, Genasi, potentially even Firbolg. And you need to think about what role they play in the world. In some worlds, they may not even exist. In other worlds, they may have entire kingdoms and empires of their own. Along with this comes exotic races such as the Drow, Dwagar, Deep Gnomes, Sea Elves, Tritons, anything that comes from the material plane but isn't something that your normal player is necessarily going to play. Tied in still is the idea of what races are dominant in the world. So in most worlds, your dominant races are going to be things like humans, elves, dwarves, but there are some worlds where it could be turned on their head and you could have an entire kingdom that's all tieflings. And they're one of the dominant forces in the world rather than just being a very rare and exotic race. Another thing to consider is your map. Now, a map certainly isn't necessary, at least at the beginning of things. Oftentimes, if you're playing a module, you will be given maps simply because the world that the module is being played in has already been created. You don't really have to do much. But just because playing a module gives you a map doesn't mean that your homebrew campaign also has to have a map. Maps can definitely be helpful for some DMs that are not necessarily as good at improvising distances and travel times. But it can also mean that you wind up getting a bit wrapped up in the whole grandeur of the world as a whole, as I sort of alluded to before. Another thing that is definitely less important at lower levels, but you certainly need to consider as your players get higher and higher levels, is how other planes fit into this world. Now, you can certainly go with the standard world tree or the great circle setup for the planes, but in some cases, in some worlds, that doesn't work as well. So you need to switch things around a little bit. For example, I ran a game once that was heavily based off of Norse mythology. So rather than taking the standard D&D planes, I modified them and combined some of them to make the 9 realms of Asgard and Midgard and so on and so forth. So now it is time to look at one of the homebrew worlds that I've made. I've made a number of homebrew worlds in my time DMing. I very rarely use modules or pre-made worlds. I almost exclusively do homebrew. I have 3 major worlds that I use, and we're going to be looking at the most recent of those, which is the one that my current campaign runs in. Now, this world is called Shangui, and the way that I created this world was I essentially had one original idea, and this is usually how I make most of my worlds. I had one original idea, which was desert dwarves. I had the idea of dwarves that, ride camels around the desert. They wear loose flowing robes and elaborate turbans decorated with jewels and gold and silver. And I thought that was a very interesting idea because typically dwarves are depicted as these hardy, oftentimes Scottish accented folk who live deep within the mountains and mine out all the gold and all that sort of thing. Standard sort of Lord of the Rings lore. But I wanted to twist that around a little bit and still have dwarves be sort of similar to how people think of them, but change their flavor a little bit. Have them be based on more Arabian culture, more kind of desert land. So that was the original idea for this world. And that then stemmed off into, well, if the dwarves live in the desert and are sort of Arabian themed, how could I fit the other races into this? How might their cultures change as well? So I used a real world proxy, which is oftentimes what I do. And at least for me, I find using real world proxies to be extremely helpful in creating worlds. It makes it a lot easier for me to describe the culture of a certain race. It helps me to describe the buildings and architectural styles of a given race or kingdom. So stemming off of that, I used the real world proxy of Asia, and then I extended it into Africa as well. So you can see if I look at the map. So here we have the dwarves, who are very sort of Arabian themed in their kingdom of Al-Balad. And then here in the middle of the continent, we have the nation of Nbari, which are the humans, which are very much themed off of tribal sub-Saharan Africa, with a little bit of influence from a few different Native American tribes as well. The humans in this world are a very nomadic people. They have a few kind of set cities, but for the most part, they're wanderers and nomads. In the north, the frozen north, I have based off of medieval Russia, the Orcish kingdom of Strania. And Strania is very much like medieval Russia. It's very cold, desolate, frozen. There's not a lot of people there. And those that are mostly clustered in and around the capital city of Kalaransk. Then over here in the east, I have the elves in the kingdom of Yuanji, which is heavily themed off of Ming Dynasty China. And the elves of this world are also very much based on the Ming Dynasty era Chinese people, mostly the Han Chinese. And then here down in the south, which you can actually kind of even see with the shape of it, I'm just noticing now, is the kingdom of Guaraji. Guaraji is a bit of an odd kingdom because I took a race that is pre-existent, the Loxodons, introduced in Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica. I've never liked the name Loxodon, but I've always liked the idea of elephant people. So I decided to rename them as the Hathi, and they rule in the kingdom of Guaraji, which is themed mostly off of medieval India and a little bit of medieval Tibet as well. So as you can tell from this world, I often use a lot of real-world input, mostly just for ease of use. As someone who's not just a Dungeons and Dragons player, but someone who also is fascinated by history, I tend to use historical analogies to figure out how the world kind of all fits together. Now, something that I tend to fall a little bit behind in, but I highly encourage you to do as DMs building your own world, is incorporate input from your players. One thing that can make a D&D world feel a lot more immersive is when a player at the table, or maybe even before the campaign starts, says something to you about the world that they'd like, and then you put it into the world. It can come in the form of either you don't really have much of a world built, maybe you're doing a bottom-up approach, and rather than building the world on your own, you kind of build the starting area of the campaign, and then as the players make their character, maybe you have one who's playing an elf, another who's playing a gnome, and you say, okay, so you're playing an elf. Tell me what elven culture is like. Where do they live? What sort of territory do they live in? What are they known for? And you just sort of build your world up through what your players tell you. one of my very good dungeon master friends builds his worlds this way. He almost always asks for player input and prefers to be told how the world works rather than telling the players how the world works. I tend to be kind of the opposite. I tend to do a top-down approach and build the entire world out and give little descriptions of the cultures of whatever kingdoms are existent, and then have my players build their characters going off of that. I hope this video has helped you gain a bit of a better understanding of the process of world building. I hope that I've been able to give you some new ideas to think about in creating your new worlds. If this video was helpful, leave me a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if there's anything you'd like to see me do on the channel in the future, just leave a comment down below. And with that, I bid you farewell, and may your adventuring days be many more.